The November wind cut through Tombstone like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of winter. The small cemetery on the hill overlooked the bustling town below, where the sounds of hammers and commerce created a steady rhythm that seemed inappropriate for such a solemn occasion. Eloise McKinnon stood beside the freshly dug grave, her black dress whipping around her ankles as she clutched a single white rose, the last flower from her husband's prized garden. The preacher's voice carried across the small gathering, his words about eternal rest and divine mercy mixing with the wind. Thomas McKinnon was a man of integrity, a pillar of this community, a devoted husband and father. But Eloise barely heard him. Her eyes kept drifting to the empty space beside her, where her son should have been standing. Samuel had arrived that morning on the 8:15 train from Phoenix, dressed in a fine black suit that probably cost more than most folks in Tombstone made in a month. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his hair was slicked back with pomade in the fashion of the wealthy businessmen he now counted among his associates. But for all his finery, he had the same restless energy that had driven him away from this small town 3 years ago. "Ma," he had said, barely touching her arm in greeting, "I'm sorry for your loss. Your loss. Not our loss. Not Pa's passing." The words had stung more than the Arizona wind. During the service, Samuel stood stiffly beside her, checking his gold pocket watch every few minutes. When neighbors approached to offer condolences, he responded with polite but distant nods, already somewhere else in his mind. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had tried to engage him in conversation about his father's last days, but Samuel's responses were clipped, businesslike. "Yes, ma'am." It was quite sudden. "No, ma'am, I hadn't seen him recently. I'm sure he's in a better place now." Empty words, hollow as an abandoned mine shaft. 20 minutes before the preacher finished, Samuel leaned close to his mother's ear. "Ma, I have to catch the afternoon train back to Phoenix. There's a meeting with some railroad investors that I cannot miss. This deal could set me up for life." Eloise turned to look at her son, really look at him, and saw a stranger. The boy who used to help his father in the stable, who carved wooden animals for the neighbor children, who cried when their old dog Rusty died, was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes held the cold calculation of someone who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "Your father is being laid to rest, Samuel," she whispered, hoping the tremble in her voice wouldn't carry to the other mourners. "And he'd understand that business comes first. He always said a man has to make his way in the world." Samuel straightened his tie and adjusted his cufflinks. "I'll write to you soon." Without another word, without waiting for the final blessing, without placing a flower on his father's grave, Samuel McKinnon turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed on the hard-packed earth as he descended the hill toward town, where his luggage waited at the depot. Eloise watched him go. This son she had carried in her womb, nursed through fevers, taught to read by lamplight in their small cabin. The other mourners pretended not to notice, but she could feel their eyes, could hear the whispers that would follow her through town for weeks to come. Poor Eloise, left all alone. That boy never did appreciate what he had. Oh, Thomas would be turning in his grave. When the preacher finally concluded the service with a prayer, the small crowd began to disperse. Doc Martinez squeezed her shoulder gently. "Thomas was a good man, Eloise. He raised a fine daughter in Mary, even if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what he meant. Mary, her daughter, had moved to California with her husband 2 years ago. She had sent a heartfelt letter expressing her sorrow and explaining that she was too far along in her pregnancy to make the dangerous journey. But Mary had also included a photograph of her children and a pressed flower from her garden, small tokens that showed she remembered her father with love. As the cemetery emptied, Eloise remained beside the grave. She knelt and placed the white rose on the fresh earth, her fingers tracing the wooden marker that would soon be replaced with a proper headstone. "I'm sorry, Thomas," she whispered. "I'm sorry he didn't stay." The wind picked up again, rustling through the desert scrub and carrying the distant whistle of the afternoon train. Samuel would be boarding now, settling into his first-class compartment, perhaps already reviewing documents for his precious meeting. He would order dinner in the dining car and sleep in a proper bed, while she would return to their empty house and sit at a kitchen table set for one. That evening, as Eloise sorted through her husband's belongings, she found his will tucked away in the old strongbox beneath their bed. Thomas had always been meticulous about such things, having learned the importance of proper documentation during his years as a clerk before they moved west. The will was written in his careful hand, witnessed by Doc Martinez and Pastor Williams, and filed with the territorial court. She read through it slowly by lamplight, her finger tracing each word. Thomas had left specific instructions about the house, the small savings account at the Tombstone Bank, and his collection of books. But it was the final paragraph that made her heart skip a beat. "I leave my son Samuel $1, as he has made it clear through his words and actions that he has no need of his family's modest estate, being a man of considerable ambition and independent means. The rest, the house, the savings, the personal belongings, was divided between Eloise and Mary, with a generous bequest to the church and smaller gifts to longtime friends and neighbors." Eloise set the will aside and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of Tombstone twinkling below. Somewhere out there, the train carrying her son was speeding through the desert night, taking him back to his new life, where family was just an inconvenience and grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. She thought about the boy Samuel used to be and the man he had become, and wondered when exactly she had lost him. Was it when he left for school in Phoenix? When he started wearing those fancy clothes? When he began measuring his success by the size of his bank account rather than the depth of his relationships? As she prepared for bed in the house that felt too large and too quiet, Eloise made a decision. She would honor her husband's wishes exactly as he had written them. Samuel had chosen his path, and now he would have to live with the consequences. The white rose on Thomas's grave would wither and blow away, but the memory of Samuel's empty chair at his father's funeral would remain forever. 3 years earlier, when Samuel McKinnon first stepped off the train in Phoenix, he carried nothing but a worn leather satchel, $23, and an unshakable belief that Tombstone had nothing more to offer him. The territorial capital buzzed with an energy that made his hometown feel like a sleepy backwater. Men in fine suits conducting business on street corners, the constant clatter of construction as the city expanded, and everywhere the scent of opportunity mixed with desert dust. Samuel's transformation didn't happen overnight. It began in the cramped boarding house room where he spent his first months, working as a clerk for Hartwell and Associates, a law firm that specialized in mining claims and railroad contracts. The work was tedious, copying documents, filing papers, running errands, but it gave him a front-row seat to how real money was made in the Arizona Territory. The key, young McKinnon, his employer, James Hartwell, had told him one evening as they worked late by gaslight, is to understand that everything is a transaction. Friendship, loyalty, even family, they're all just currencies to be spent wisely. Samuel had nodded eagerly, absorbing every word from the older man, who seemed to have his finger on the pulse of every major deal in the territory. Hartwell drove a fine carriage, lived in a grand house on the outskirts of town, and wore gold cufflinks that caught the light whenever he gestured. This was the life Samuel wanted. Within 6 months, Samuel had learned to dress like the men he admired. Wool suits instead of cotton work clothes, leather shoes instead of boots, and a pocket watch that he checked frequently to give the impression of a man with important appointments. He practiced speaking like them too, eliminating the rougher edges of his small-town accent and adopting the clipped, efficient manner of speech that marked a serious businessman. The letters home became shorter and less frequent. Where once he had written detailed accounts of his daily life, asking about the neighbors and his father's health, now he sent brief updates focused entirely on his professional advancement. Dear Ma and Pa, I have been promoted to junior associate at the firm. The work is demanding but rewarding. Please give my regards to everyone in town. Your son, Samuel. He stopped asking about the weather in Tombstone, stopped inquiring about Mrs. Henderson's arthritis, or whether the new preacher was settling in well. Those details, once so important to him, now seemed like distractions from his larger purpose. The turning point came during his second year in Phoenix, when Hartwell brought him along to a meeting with railroad executives from back east. The men gathered in the smoking room of the finest hotel in the city, their conversation flowing between stock prices, land acquisitions, and political connections with an ease that Samuel envied. The Southern Pacific needs reliable local partners, one of the executives explained, his Boston accent crisp and commanding. Men who understand the territory but can think beyond it. The future of the West isn't in digging holes in the ground, it's in connecting those holes to the rest of the world. Samuel listened intently as they discussed plans for branch lines that would link smaller mining towns to the main railroad network. The profits, they explained, would come not just from transporting ore, but from the land speculation that followed the railroad's path. A man with the right information and sufficient capital could purchase worthless desert acreage that would become valuable town sites within a year. That night, Samuel sat in his boarding house room with a map of Arizona spread across his small desk, tracing potential railroad routes with his finger. He began to see the territory not as the collection of struggling towns and hard-scrabble ranches he had grown up with, but as a vast game board where fortunes could be won or lost based on one's ability to anticipate the next move. He started spending his evenings in the hotel bars and private clubs where deals were made, nursing expensive whiskey and listening to conversations about copper futures and territorial politics. He learned to play poker not for the money, though he was careful never to lose more than he could afford, but for the connections. Around those green felt tables, barriers came down, and men spoke more freely about their plans and partnerships. It was during one such game that Samuel met Marcus Vance, a cattle baron from California who was looking to expand his operations into Arizona. Vance had money, but lacked the local knowledge to navigate territorial regulations and land claims. Samuel, drawing on his experience at the law firm, was able to provide information that saved Vance thousands of dollars in a complex land deal. "You've got a sharp mind, McKinnon," Vance had said, dealing another hand, "and more importantly, you understand that sentiment is the enemy of profit. Too many men out here get attached to places and people. That's fine for shopkeepers and farmers, but a man with real ambition has to be willing to go where the opportunity takes him." The words resonated with Samuel more than he cared to admit. When he thought about Tombstone now, it seemed like a place frozen in time, where people clung to old ways and small dreams. His father, for all his kindness and integrity, had never owned more than a modest house and a small savings account. His mother still darned socks and grew vegetables in a kitchen garden, unable to see beyond the narrow horizons of their little world. During his rare visits home, the contrast became increasingly stark. The conversations around the dinner table seemed trivial: who was courting whom, what the weather had been like, how the new territorial governor's policies might affect the local mines. Samuel found himself checking his pocket watch frequently, calculating how soon he could politely excuse himself and return to Phoenix. "You seem different, son," his father had observed during his last visit, just 6 months before his death. They were sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Different how?" Samuel had asked, though he knew exactly what his father meant. "Restless, like you're always somewhere else in your mind." Thomas McKinnon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Success is important, Samuel, but it shouldn't come at the cost of who you are." Samuel had bristled at the implication. "I know exactly who I am, Pa. I'm a man who's not content to spend his life in a town that's already seen its best days." The hurt in his father's eyes was unmistakable, but Samuel had pressed on, unable or unwilling to stop himself. You and Ma act like Tombstone is the center of the universe, but it's not. There's a whole world out there, and I intend to make my mark on it. And what about the mark it makes on you? His father had asked quietly. But Samuel had been too young, too proud, and too hungry for success to understand what his father meant. He saw only the opportunities that waited for him in Phoenix, the deals to be made, the fortune to be built. Family, he had come to believe, was something a man enjoyed after he had secured his place in the world, not something that should hold him back from achieving it. The night before his father's funeral, Samuel sat in his first-class compartment aboard the train to Tombstone, reviewing documents for the railroad deal that had consumed his attention for months. The contracts spread across his lap represented more money than his father had ever seen, more than his entire hometown generated in a year. This was his moment, his chance to prove that he had been right to leave, right to choose ambition over sentiment. He barely glanced out the window as the train passed through the desert landscape of his childhood, his mind already focused on the meeting that would wait for him in Phoenix. The funeral was an obligation, a brief interruption in his pursuit of the future he had planned so carefully. Samuel McKinnon had become exactly the man he had set out to be. He just hadn't considered what he might lose in the process. The house felt different after the funeral. Not just empty, Eloise had expected that, but somehow smaller, as if the walls had moved closer together while she wasn't looking. Thomas's coffee cup still sat on the kitchen table where he had left it 3 days ago, the morning before his heart gave out while he was feeding the chickens. She'd washed it twice, but kept setting it back in the same spot, unable to break the habit of preparing for two. Doc Martinez had stopped by every day since the funeral, ostensibly to check on her health, but really to make sure she wasn't sitting alone with her grief for too long. He found her that first Wednesday morning, sitting in Thomas's chair on the front porch, staring at the empty chicken coop. "They all flew away," she said without looking up as he climbed the front steps. "The chickens. I forgot to latch the gate properly yesterday, and this morning they were just gone." Doc Martinez settled into the chair beside her, his medical bag resting against his legs. He was a small man, with gentle hands and kind eyes, who had delivered half the babies in Tombstone and sat with their grandparents as they passed from this world. "Birds know when things change," he said quietly. "They can sense when a place isn't the same anymore." Eloise nodded, still watching the open gate swing gently in the morning breeze. "Thomas always said they were smarter than people gave them credit for. Maybe they knew he wasn't coming back to feed them." "Have you heard from Samuel?" Doc Martinez asked, though he already knew the answer from the expression on her face. "A telegram," she said, pulling a crumpled Western Union message from her apron pocket. 3 lines. "Arrived safely. Meeting went well. Will write soon. Signed S. McKinnon, like I might not remember his name." Doc Martinez read the telegram, noting its impersonal tone. In his 40 years of practice, he had seen how grief affected families, how some were drawn together by loss, while others were torn apart. But he had never seen anything quite like the cold distance Samuel had shown at his own father's funeral. "People grieve differently," he offered, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. "Do they?" Eloise took the telegram back and folded it carefully. "Or do some people just not grieve at all?" Over the following weeks, Eloise tried to establish new routines to fill the silence that had settled over her life like dust after a windstorm. She joined the church ladies' auxiliary, spending Tuesday mornings preparing meals for families with new babies or recent losses. She took on extra sewing work, mending clothes for the miners and their families. She even considered taking in a boarder, though the thought of a stranger sleeping in Samuel's old room made her stomach clench. But no amount of activity could fill the particular emptiness left by her son's absence. It wasn't just that he lived far away. Plenty of mothers in Tombstone had children scattered across the territory and beyond. It was the quality of his absence, the way he had seemed to write off not just the town, but everyone in it, including his own family. The letters she had promised herself she wouldn't wait for never came. Weeks passed without word from Phoenix. When she asked at the post office, old Pete Garrison shook his head sympathetically. "Nothing for you today, Mrs. McKinnon, but you know how the mail can be, what with the railroad schedules and all." She knew Pete was trying to be kind, but they both understood that regular mail service between Phoenix and Tombstone was reliable. Samuel simply wasn't writing. Meanwhile, the practical realities of widowhood began to assert themselves. The house needed repairs that Thomas had been planning to make come spring. Loose boards on the front steps, a leak in the roof above the kitchen, a broken latch on the root cellar door. In the past, she might have asked Samuel to handle such things during his visits, but those visits had become so infrequent and brief that there had never been time. Instead, she found herself relying on the kindness of neighbors. Jim Crawford, who ran the livery stable, came by one Saturday morning with his tools and spent the day fixing everything that needed attention. He refused payment, saying only that Thomas had been a good friend and neighbor. "That's what we do here," he said as he tested the repaired front steps. "We look after each other." The words carried an unspoken criticism of Samuel's absence, though Jim was too polite to say it directly. But Eloise heard it anyway, just as she heard it in the gentle questions from other townspeople who asked about her son with carefully neutral expressions. "How is Samuel doing in Phoenix? Has he found himself a nice girl yet? I imagine he's quite the successful businessman by now." Each question was a small reminder that her son had not just left Tombstone, he had abandoned it, and by extension, abandoned her. She began to dread these well-meaning inquiries, practicing responses that wouldn't reveal how completely Samuel had cut himself off from his family. "He's doing very well, thank you for asking. Oh, you know how busy young men get with their careers. I'm sure he'll visit when he can find the time." Lies wrapped in politeness, covering the painful truth that she no longer knew her son at all. The breaking point came 6 weeks after the funeral, when Eloise received a letter not from Samuel, but from a bank in Phoenix. The formal language confused her at first, but gradually the meaning became clear. Samuel was applying for a substantial business loan and had listed his family home in Tombstone as collateral without her knowledge or consent. The letter requested that she confirm the property's value and her willingness to co-sign the loan agreement. It was signed by a bank officer she had never heard of and referenced young Mr. McKinnon's promising business venture, as if her family home was nothing more than a poker chip in one of his deals. Eloise read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Her son was not only willing to risk the house she and Thomas had built together, he had assumed she would agree to it without even asking. The arrogance of it took her breath away. She walked to Thomas's old desk and pulled out a sheet of paper, dipping her pen in ink with hands that trembled slightly with anger. "Dear sirs, I am writing to inform you that I have no knowledge of this loan application and do not consent to using my property as collateral for any business venture undertaken by my son, Samuel McKinnon. Please remove my name and property from all documentation related to this matter immediately. Sincerely, Mrs. Eloise McKinnon." She posted the letter that same day, paying extra for rapid delivery. Then she sat down and wrote another letter, this one to Samuel himself. "Dear Samuel, I received an interesting letter from the First National Bank of Phoenix today regarding your loan application. Since you didn't see fit to discuss this matter with me personally, I have taken the liberty of declining their request. Perhaps in the future you will remember that some things cannot simply be taken for granted. Your mother, Eloise McKinnon." She sent this letter by regular post, imagining Samuel's face when he realized his careful plans had been derailed by the very woman he had dismissed as unimportant to his success. 2 weeks later, Samuel's reply arrived. The first communication she had received from him since his 3-line telegram after the funeral. "Dear Mother, I hope you understand that the bank matter was simply a formality. I never intended to put the family home at risk, and I apologize if the paperwork was confusing. I have secured alternative funding for my business ventures. I trust you are well and managing adequately on your own. Please give my regards to everyone in town. Respectfully, Samuel. Even his apology was cold and calculating, more concerned with damage control than genuine remorse. The phrase, managing adequately on your own, particularly stung, as if her ability to survive without him was somehow surprising. That night, Eloise sat in her kitchen with Thomas's will spread on the table before her. She had read it dozens of times since the funeral, but now she saw it with new clarity. Her husband had understood their son better than she had realized. Thomas had seen what Samuel was becoming long before the funeral, long before the bank letter, long before the silence that followed. The $1 bequest wasn't cruelty, it was wisdom. Thomas had known that some lessons could only be learned through consequences, and some children only valued what they thought they might lose. Eloise folded the will carefully and returned it to the strong box beneath her bed. Samuel had made his choice years ago, choosing ambition over family, success over love, independence over connection. Now he would have to live with the results of that choice. As she prepared for bed, Eloise felt something she hadn't experienced since the funeral, a sense of peace. She was not the one who had broken their family. She was not the one who had chosen money over memory, business over blood. Samuel had drawn the lines that separated them, and now he would discover where those lines led. The house was still too quiet, still too empty, but it was her house now. And for the first time since Thomas's death, that felt like enough. Samuel McKinnon's office on the 3rd floor of the Territorial Building commanded an impressive view of Phoenix's glowing skyline, though he rarely took time to appreciate it. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows illuminated stacks of contracts, survey maps, and correspondence that covered nearly every surface of the room. This was where he had built his reputation as one of the territory's most successful land speculators and railroad consultants, a man who could smell opportunity from 50 miles away and had the nerve to bet everything on his instincts. The bank letter incident had been a minor setback, nothing more. Within a week of his mother's unexpected refusal to co-sign his loan, Samuel had secured funding from Marcus Vance and 2 other investors who recognized the value of his railroad expansion proposal. The fact that he had been forced to give up a larger percentage of the profits stung, but it was a manageable loss. In business, as James Hartwell had taught him, setbacks were simply the cost of moving forward. "McKinnon, you've got that look again," observed Henry Colburn, his junior partner, as he entered the office carrying a stack of territorial survey reports. Colburn was a younger man who had come west from Chicago with more enthusiasm than experience, but he had proven useful in handling the detail work that Samuel found tedious. "What look is that?" Samuel asked without glancing up from the contract he was reviewing. "The one that means you're about to make someone very rich or very poor, and you haven't decided which yet." Samuel allowed himself a rare smile. "Both, actually. The Southern Pacific has agreed to extend the branch line through Prescott, which means every acre between here and there is about to triple in value. The question is whether we buy land or buy into the railroad itself." He spread a territorial map across his desk, marking potential routes with a red pencil. The railroad company's plans were still confidential, but Samuel had cultivated enough contacts within the organization to know which way the tracks would run. Information, he had learned, was worth more than gold if you knew how to use it. "What about the existing landowners?" Colburn asked, studying the map. "Some of these ranchers have been working the same plots for 20 years. "Progress waits for no one," Samuel replied dismissively. "If they're smart, they'll sell before the railroad makes the decision for them. If they're not—" He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. This was the kind of thinking that had made Samuel wealthy, but would have horrified the man he used to be. The boy who had grown up in Tombstone would have worried about displacing families, about the impact on communities that had struggled to build something lasting in the harsh desert. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who saw such concerns as luxuries he couldn't afford. The morning passed in a flurry of meetings and correspondence. Samuel dictated letters to potential investors, reviewed survey reports with territorial officials, and hosted a lunch for railroad executives at the Palace Hotel. By 2 o'clock, he had commitments for nearly $50,000 in land purchases and a handshake agreement to serve as a consultant on the new branch line construction. It was during his afternoon appointment with the bank president that Samuel received news that momentarily disrupted his focus. Benjamin Ashford, a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and an expensive suit, had been discussing loan terms when he mentioned an unexpected development. "I should tell you, McKinnon, that we received an unusual letter a few weeks ago regarding a loan application you had submitted." Samuel's hand paused over the contract he was signing. "Oh? Yes, from a Mrs. Eloise McKinnon in Tombstone. She was quite firm in declining to serve as co-signer for any business ventures. I trust this doesn't affect your current application, since you provided alternative collateral." "Not at all," Samuel replied smoothly, though inwardly he felt a familiar flash of irritation. "That was a preliminary inquiry only. My mother is unaccustomed to business matters." Ashford nodded understandingly. "Of course. Though I must say her letter was quite articulate for someone unfamiliar with financial affairs. She seemed to understand the implications perfectly." The comment lingered in Samuel's mind as he walked back to his office. He had dismissed his mother as a simple woman who spent her days tending house and garden, someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of territorial commerce. But her letter to the bank had been sharp, decisive, and strategically timed to cause maximum disruption to his plans. Perhaps he had underestimated her. That evening, Samuel attended a reception at the territorial governor's mansion, where the territory's business and political elite gathered to discuss the future of Arizona. The conversation flowed easily between railroad expansion, mining rights, and statehood prospects, but Samuel found his attention wandering. "You seem distracted tonight," observed Catherine Morrison, the daughter of a prominent cattle rancher and one of Phoenix's most eligible young women. She was an intelligent, attractive woman who had made it clear that she would welcome Samuel's romantic attention, but he had always been too focused on business to pursue personal relationships seriously. "Just thinking about opportunity," Samuel replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "The territory is changing so rapidly that a man has to stay alert or risk missing the next wave of progress." "And what about the people the progress leaves behind?" Catherine asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. "My father says some of the old-timers are having trouble adapting to how quickly things are moving." Samuel was quiet for a moment, thinking about Tombstone and the life he had left behind. "Change is difficult," he admitted, "but the alternative is stagnation. A territory either grows or dies, and growing requires making hard choices, even when those choices affect family." The question caught Samuel off guard. "I'm sorry?" Catherine smiled, but there was something knowing in her expression. "I heard about your father's passing. I'm sorry for your loss. It must be difficult being so far from home when family needs you." Samuel felt a defensive wall rise automatically. "My family understands that my work here benefits everyone in the long run. The economic development I'm helping to create will improve conditions throughout the territory." "I'm sure that's true," Catherine said gently, "but I've always wondered if success means much if you don't have people to share it with." Before Samuel could respond, Marcus Vance appeared at his elbow, eager to discuss the latest developments in their railroad investment. The conversation with Catherine was forgotten as Samuel was drawn back into the familiar world of deals and projections. But her words echoed in his mind as he walked home through the gaslit streets of Phoenix. His apartment was a reflection of his priorities: expensive furniture, fine art, and a library filled with books on commerce and territorial law, but no personal photographs, no mementos from his childhood, nothing that connected him to the life he had left behind. He had built his success by cutting away everything that might hold him back, but standing in his elegant, empty rooms, Samuel wondered for the first time if he had cut away too much. He poured himself a whiskey and sat at his desk, pulling out a sheet of paper. For several minutes he stared at the blank page, trying to formulate words that might bridge the distance that had grown between him and his mother. But what could he say? That he was sorry for leaving the funeral early? That business really was more important than grief? That he had tried to use their family home as collateral without asking because he no longer thought of it as home at all? The truth was too painful to write, and lies would only make things worse. So Samuel set the paper aside and focused instead on the railroad contracts that covered his desk. This was his world now, a world of carefully calculated risks and precisely measured rewards, where emotional attachments were liabilities and family was just another word for obligation. But as he worked late into the night, reviewing survey maps and investment projections, Samuel couldn't shake the memory of Catherine Morrison's question or the sharp intelligence he had heard in his mother's letter to the bank. For the first time since leaving Tombstone, he wondered if the price of his success might be higher than he had realized. Outside his window, Phoenix slept under a canopy of stars that stretched all the way to Tombstone, where a woman named Eloise McKinnon sat in an empty house, reading her husband's will by lamplight and understanding more about business and family than her son had ever given her credit for. The law office of Whitman and Associates occupied the ground floor of a modest building on Fremont Street, its windows offering a clear view of the courthouse where Thomas McKinnon had once filed mining claims for his neighbors. Attorney James Whitman had practiced law in Tombstone for 15 years, handling everything from property disputes to cattle-rustling cases, but he had never presided over a will reading quite like this one. 3 months had passed since Thomas McKinnon's funeral, and Eloise sat in the leather chair across from Whitman's desk with a composure that impressed the attorney. She wore her best black dress and had pinned her graying hair back in a neat bun, giving her the appearance of a woman prepared for serious business. Beside her sat Mary, who had made the difficult journey from California despite her advanced pregnancy, her presence a stark contrast to the empty chair that should have held Samuel. "Mrs. McKinnon," Whitman began, adjusting his spectacles, "I should mention that I sent word to your son in Phoenix about today's proceedings. I received a telegram yesterday morning indicating that he would attempt to attend, but his train has apparently been delayed." Eloise nodded without expression. She had not heard from Samuel since his cold response to the bank letter incident, and she suspected his absence today was more calculated than circumstantial. "We can proceed," she said simply. Samuel made his priorities clear at his father's funeral. Mary reached over and squeezed her mother's hand, a gesture that conveyed both support and understanding. Unlike her brother, Mary had maintained regular correspondence with her parents, sharing news of her children and asking detailed questions about life in Tombstone. Her presence today, despite the discomfort and expense of travel, demonstrated the kind of loyalty that Samuel had abandoned. Whitman cleared his throat and began reading Thomas McKinnon's will in his careful, professional voice. The document was straightforward in most respects. The house and its contents to Eloise, a substantial bequest to Mary for her children's education, donations to the church, and several local charities. It was the section regarding Samuel that caused Whitman to pause and glance at the two women. "To my son Samuel, I leave the sum of $1, as he has demonstrated through his words and actions that he has no need of his family's modest estate, being a man of considerable ambition and independent means." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of footsteps on the boardwalk outside and the distant whistle of the morning train from Phoenix. Mary's eyes widened with surprise, but Eloise merely nodded, as if she had expected this provision. Was he angry with Samuel? Mary asked quietly. Eloise considered the question carefully. Your father was many things, but angry wasn't one of them. He was disappointed, certainly, but mostly he was clear-sighted about what people's choices revealed about their character. Whitman continued reading, outlining the practical details of the inheritance and the responsibilities it entailed. The McKinnon house was valuable by Tombstone standards, and the savings account Thomas had accumulated through years of careful frugality would provide Eloise with a comfortable, if modest, security for the rest of her life. As the attorney concluded the formal reading, the door to the office opened with a jingle of bells. Samuel McKinnon stood in the doorway, slightly out of breath and covered with the dust of hasty travel. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled, and his face showed the strain of someone who had spent the night on an uncomfortable train. I apologize for my tardiness, he said, removing his hat and trying to smooth his appearance. The railroad experienced mechanical difficulties outside of Tucson. Eloise looked at her son with the same cool regard she might give a stranger who had interrupted a private conversation. Mr. Whitman was just finishing, she said. Samuel took the remaining chair, glancing between his mother and sister with an expression that seemed to be calculating the situation. I trust everything is in order. Father was always meticulous about such matters. Whitman handed Samuel a copy of the will, watching carefully as the younger man's eyes scanned the document. The attorney had presided over many such moments and had learned to read the subtle signs of shock, anger, and grief that accompanied the reading of wills. But Samuel's face revealed nothing. No surprise, no hurt, no recognition of the deeper meaning behind his father's final judgment. I see, Samuel said after a moment, setting the papers aside. Well, Father certainly made his intentions clear. Mary stared at her brother in disbelief. That's all you have to say? Samuel, he left you $1, a single dollar. Samuel shrugged with studied indifference. It's his prerogative. I've been successful enough in my own endeavors that his estate wouldn't have made a significant difference in my circumstances. The casual dismissal of their father's final gesture cut through the room like a knife. Eloise felt something cold and final settle in her chest, not grief, but a kind of clarity that comes when illusions are finally stripped away. No, she said quietly. I don't suppose it would have made a difference to you. Whitman, sensing the tension, began gathering the papers. There are a few administrative matters to attend to, but nothing that requires immediate action. Mrs. McKinnon, if you'd like to schedule another appointment to discuss the transfer of property, that won't be necessary. Samuel interrupted, standing abruptly. I have business to attend to in Phoenix. Mother, I trust you'll manage everything appropriately. He moved toward the door, then paused as if remembering something. Mary, congratulations on the pregnancy. I hope the child is healthy. The words were polite but empty, spoken with the same tone he might use to comment on the weather. Samuel, wait, Mary called after him. Don't you think we should talk about this, about what Father meant? Samuel turned back, and for a moment his carefully constructed facade slipped, revealing something raw and defensive beneath. I know exactly what Father meant. He disapproved of my choices, of my success, of the fact that I outgrew this place and everything in it. The dollar is his way of saying that I don't belong here anymore, that I never belonged here. That's not what he meant at all, Eloise said, rising from her chair. For the first time since the funeral, real emotion colored her voice. He meant that a man who values money above family doesn't deserve either. Samuel's jaw tightened. And what would you know about the value of money, Mother? You've never had to earn your way in the world, never had to compete for anything, never had to prove yourself to anyone outside this little town. You're right, Eloise replied evenly. I've never had to prove myself to strangers because I already knew who I was. I was a woman who raised children, who stood by her husband, who helped her neighbors, who understood that some things can't be bought or sold or traded away for profit. The two faced each other across the small office, years of accumulated distance and disappointment crystallizing into this moment of complete honesty. Samuel saw his mother clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the simple, small-town woman he had imagined, but as someone who had made different choices about what mattered in life and was completely secure in those choices. "I have a train to catch," he said finally, settling his hat on his head. "Give my regards to the town." He left without looking back, his footsteps echoing on the boardwalk as he walked toward the depot. Through the window, Eloise and Mary watched him go. This man who had once been a boy they loved, and who had somehow become a stranger who shared only their name. "Will he come back?" Mary quietly asked. Eloise was quiet for a long moment, watching Samuel's figure disappear into the crowd of miners and merchants who filled Tombstone streets. "I don't know," she said finally, "but if he does, it will have to be as someone different than who he is today." That afternoon, as the train carried Samuel back toward Phoenix and the business deals that consumed his life, he stared out at the desert landscape and tried to convince himself that he felt nothing about his father's final judgment. The dollar was symbolic, meaningless, a gesture from a man who had never understood the realities of the modern world. But as the miles rolled past, Samuel found himself thinking not about railroad contracts or land speculation, but about the look in his mother's eyes when she spoke about knowing who she was. For the first time since leaving Tombstone, he wondered if he could say the same about himself. The will was final, the inheritance decided, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The telegram arrived at Samuel's office on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 6 months after the will reading. Henry Colburn found his partner staring at the yellow paper with an expression that seemed to shift between shock and something that might have been fear. "Bad news from back east?" Colburn asked, settling into the chair across from Samuel's desk. "Tombstone," Samuel replied, his voice oddly flat. "My mother is ill, pneumonia. The doctor says—" He paused, rereading the telegram as if the words might change. "The doctor says I should come if I want to see her again." The message was signed by Doc Martinez, whose careful handwriting Samuel remembered from childhood visits when he'd suffered the usual scrapes and fevers of youth. The brevity of the telegram somehow made it more alarming than a longer explanation would have been. "When will you leave?" Colburn asked. Samuel set the telegram aside and turned to the stack of contracts that covered his desk. "The Morrison cattle deal closes Thursday. The railroad survey is due Friday. I can't possibly—" He stopped mid-sentence, hearing his own words as if spoken by someone else. 6 months ago, he had left his father's funeral early for a business meeting. Now he was contemplating missing his mother's final days for a cattle transaction and a survey report. "Henry," he said quietly, "cancel my appointments for the rest of the week." The train journey to Tombstone felt different this time, though Samuel couldn't initially identify why. The landscape hadn't changed. The same desert vistas, the same small towns, the same mountains rising from the valley floor. But as the miles passed, he found himself paying attention to details he had ignored during previous trips. The way the morning light struck the saguaro cacti, the colors in the rock formations, the small homesteads scattered across the valley, each representing someone's dream of building something lasting in an unforgiving land. He arrived in Tombstone on Wednesday evening as the sun was setting behind the Dragoon Mountains. The town looked smaller than he remembered, though he realized this was probably because Phoenix had grown so dramatically during his years there. Main Street still bustled with miners heading to the saloons after their shifts, but there was a settled quality to the place that suggested its boom days were passing. Doc Martinez met him at the depot, looking older and more worn than Samuel remembered. "Thank you for coming," the doctor said simply, taking Samuel's travel bag. "She's been asking for you." They walked through the familiar streets in relative silence, past the shops and businesses where Samuel had spent his childhood. Mrs. Henderson waved from the doorway of the general store, though her expression was reserved. Jim Crawford nodded from the livery stable, his greeting polite but cool. Samuel realized that his reputation in town had been shaped by his behavior at the funeral and his subsequent absence. "How long has she been sick?" Samuel asked as they approached the McKinnon house. 2 weeks, though she probably felt poorly for longer than that and didn't want to admit it. You know how she is, about not wanting to be a bother to anyone. Doc Martinez paused at the front gate. "Samuel, I should warn you, she's very weak. The pneumonia has taken a lot out of her." The house where Samuel had grown up looked exactly as he remembered, from the wooden steps his father had built to the rose bushes his mother tended beside the front porch. But stepping inside felt like entering a memory. Everything was smaller, more modest than his recollection. The furniture he had once thought elegant now seemed simple, even austere. The rooms that had felt spacious in childhood were revealed as the cramped quarters of a working family. Eloise lay in the bed she had shared with Thomas for 30 years, propped up on pillows to help her breathing. She looked fragile in a way that shocked Samuel. Not just ill, but genuinely old for the first time in his memory. Her hair, now completely grey, was braided loosely over one shoulder, and her hands, folded on the quilt, seemed almost transparent in the lamplight. "Samuel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you came." "Of course I came," he replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. It was the same chair where his father used to sit when reading bedtime stories, where his mother had kept vigil during childhood illnesses, where Mary had nursed her own children during visits home. Eloise studied her son's face with eyes that were still sharp despite her illness. "You look tired," she observed. "Are you taking care of yourself?" The question was so typically maternal, so focused on his well-being despite her own condition, that Samuel felt something crack inside his chest. "I'm fine, Ma. Don't worry about me." They sat in silence for a few minutes, the space between them filled with years of accumulated distance and disappointment. Finally, Eloise spoke again. "I've been thinking about your father's will," she said. "About that dollar." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "Ma, you don't need to—" "Let me finish." Despite her weakness, there was still authority in her voice. "I think Thomas was wrong." Samuel looked up in surprise. This was not what he had expected. "Not about leaving you the dollar," Eloise continued. "He was wrong to think that would teach you anything. Some lessons can't be taught, Samuel. They have to be learned." "What do you mean?" Eloise was quiet for a moment, gathering her strength. "I mean that no inheritance, no matter how large or small, would have made you understand what you lost when you walked away from us. The money was never the point." Samuel leaned forward, studying his mother's face. "Then what was the point?" "The point," Eloise said softly, "was love, family, belonging to something larger than yourself. Your father thought the dollar would make you realize you had thrown those things away for nothing. But I know better now. You can't make someone value what they've never learned to see." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He had spent months telling himself that his father's will was about money, about property, about the practical distribution of assets. But his mother was right. It had always been about something deeper, something he had systematically devalued in his pursuit of success. "I see them now," he said quietly. "Do you?" Eloise's eyes searched his face. "Or do you just see what you've lost?" Samuel was quiet for a long time, listening to his mother's labored breathing and the familiar sounds of evening in Tombstone. Voices from the street, the distant music from the saloons, the barking of dogs. These were the sounds of his childhood, the backdrop of a life he had abandoned in favor of the sophisticated bustle of Phoenix. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've spent so long focused on building something bigger, something more important than what I left behind, that I'm not sure I remember how to value what I have instead of what I want." Eloise reached out and took his hand, her fingers surprisingly strong despite her illness. "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in years." Over the next 3 days, Samuel remained at his mother's bedside. leaving only to take meals with Doc Martinez or to walk through town when Eloise insisted he needed fresh air. During those walks, he found himself seeing Tombstone through different eyes. The modest homes and small businesses that had once seemed like symbols of limited ambition now appeared as evidence of something else: community, stability, the satisfaction of building something lasting rather than something merely profitable. He stopped by the cemetery to visit his father's grave, where a proper headstone now marked the spot where he had left so abruptly months before. Someone had planted flowers around the base, probably his mother before she became ill. Samuel knelt and placed his hand on the carved stone, finally understanding what his father had tried to tell him during that last conversation on the front porch. Success is important, Samuel, but it shouldn't come at the cost of who you are. Now, kneeling beside his father's grave with his mother dying in the house below, Samuel finally understood what those words meant. He had achieved everything he had set out to accomplish in Phoenix: wealth, respect, influence. But in the process, he had become someone his parents no longer recognized, someone his sister regarded with polite distance, someone who had no real friends, only business associates. On Friday evening, as Doc Martinez checked on Eloise's condition, Samuel sat beside her bed and did something he hadn't done since childhood. He told her about his life. Not the successful parts, not the impressive deals or the growing bank account, but the lonely parts, the empty apartment, the superficial relationships, the constant pressure to achieve more, acquire more, become more than he was. "I've built everything I thought I wanted," he said quietly, "but I don't know who I built it for." Eloise smiled, the first genuine smile she had given him since his arrival. "Then maybe it's time to start over. Is it too late for that?" His mother was quiet for a moment, her breathing shallow but steady. "It's too late to undo the choices you've made, Samuel, but it's never too late to start making different ones." That night, as Samuel sat in the chair beside his mother's bed, listening to her sleep and watching the play of moonlight through the window, he began to understand the true cost of his success. He had gained a fortune, but lost a family. He had built a reputation, but destroyed relationships. He had achieved independence, but found himself completely alone. For the first time since leaving Tombstone, Samuel McKinnon began to consider the possibility that he had been pursuing the wrong kind of wealth altogether. Eloise McKinnon passed away peacefully on a Sunday morning as the church bells rang across Tombstone, calling the faithful to worship. Samuel was holding her hand when her breathing simply stopped, so quietly that for a moment he thought she was merely sleeping more deeply. Doc Martinez, who had been dozing in the chair by the window, opened his eyes and knew immediately from Samuel's expression that Eloise had slipped away. "She waited for you," the doctor said softly, rising to check for a pulse that they both knew was no longer there. "I've seen it before. Sometimes people hold on until they know their loved ones will be all right." Samuel continued holding his mother's hand, studying her face in the morning light. Death had erased the lines of pain and worry, leaving her looking younger, more like the woman who had raised him and Mary with such patient determination. "Will I be all right?" he asked, the question surprising him with its honesty. Doc Martinez closed Eloise's eyes gently and pulled the quilt up to her chin. "That depends on what you do next." The funeral was held 3 days later, and this time Samuel stayed until the end. He helped carry his mother's coffin to the cemetery on the hill, stood beside her grave as Pastor Williams spoke about a life well lived, and shook hands with every person who came to pay their respects. The gathering was larger than his father's funeral had been. Eloise had touched more lives during her years in Tombstone, and her quiet acts of kindness had created a web of relationships that extended throughout the community. After the service, as the crowd dispersed, Samuel remained beside the grave. 2 headstones now marked the McKinnon family plot, and he realized that someday a third would bear his own name, if he chose to be buried here, among the people he had once been so eager to leave behind. Mary approached him as he stood contemplating the graves. Her pregnancy was now quite advanced, and she moved carefully across the uneven ground of the cemetery. "Are you going back to Phoenix?" she asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the mourners make their way down the hill toward town. "I don't know," he said finally. "Everything I built there seems very far away right now." "You could stay," Mary suggested gently. "The house is yours now, along with everything else. Ma left it all to you in her will." Samuel looked at his sister in surprise. "But the original will, Ma wrote a new one after she got sick. She said people deserved a chance to change, even if they didn't always take it." Mary paused, choosing her words carefully. "She left me a small bequest for the children's education, but everything else goes to you. The house, the savings, even Pa's books." The revelation hit Samuel harder than he had expected. Even after everything, his coldness at the funeral, his absence during the months that followed, his dismissive response to the original will, his mother had chosen to trust him with the family legacy. "Why?" he asked. Mary smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like their mother. "Because she loved you. Because she believed that underneath all that ambition and pride, you were still the boy who used to carve wooden animals for the neighbor children." That evening, Samuel walked through the house alone, seeing it with new eyes. The modest furniture and simple decorations that had once seemed like symbols of limitation now appeared as evidence of something else. Lives lived with purpose, relationships valued over possessions, contentment found in simple things well done. In his parents' bedroom, he found a box of letters tied with ribbon. His mother had kept every communication he had sent from Phoenix, even the brief, impersonal notes that contained nothing but updates on his business activities. Beneath those were older letters, detailed accounts of his early days in the territorial capital, when he had still cared about sharing his experiences with family. Reading through them, Samuel could trace the exact path of his transformation from hopeful young man to calculating businessman. The letters grew shorter, more formal, less personal, until they contained nothing of himself at all. His mother had saved them all, perhaps hoping that someday the son she remembered would return to the pages of his correspondence. The next morning, Samuel walked to the office of James Whitman, the attorney who had handled both of his parents' wills. He found the older man preparing for a trial, surrounded by law books and legal documents. "Mr. McKinnon," Whitman said, looking up from his work, "I was sorry to hear about your mother. She was a remarkable woman." "She was," Samuel agreed. "Mr. Whitman, I wanted to ask you about something. The new will. When did she write it?" Whitman consulted his records. "About 2 months ago, shortly after she first became ill. She came here on a Tuesday morning and said she needed to make some changes. Very clear about what she wanted, very specific about her reasons." "What reasons?" Whitman studied Samuel carefully before answering. "She said that punishment was a luxury she couldn't afford, that her job was to love her children, not to judge them. She said everyone deserved a chance to find their way home, even if they had to take the long road to get there." Samuel left the attorney's office and walked slowly through Tombstone, past the businesses and homes where people were beginning their daily routines. He stopped at the general store, where Mrs. Henderson greeted him with surprising warmth. "Samuel, I'm so sorry about your mother. She spoke of you often, you know, always proud, always hoping you'd find your way back to visit more often." At the livery stable, Jim Crawford shook his hand and offered condolences. "Your pa was a good man, and your ma was a saint. This town won't be the same without her." Similar conversations occurred throughout the day as Samuel encountered people who had known his family for decades. Each interaction revealed something he had forgotten or never fully understood, that his parents had been genuinely loved and respected in this community, that their quiet lives had mattered to people beyond their immediate family, that the modest existence he had rejected was actually rich in ways he was only now beginning to comprehend. That evening, Samuel sat on the front porch of his childhood home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. A telegram from Henry Colburn lay unopened on the table beside him, probably containing urgent news about business matters in Phoenix. But for the first time in years, Samuel felt no urgency to respond to such summons. Instead, he found himself thinking about his mother's final words. It's never too late to start making different ones. The choices she had meant, the decisions that shaped a life, that determined what kind of person you became and what kind of legacy you left behind. Samuel McKinnon had spent 5 years building a fortune and a reputation in Phoenix. But sitting on his parents' front porch, surrounded by the quiet sounds of evening in Tombstone, he realized that he had also spent those years building walls between himself and his family, between his ambitions and his values, between the man he had become and the boy he had once been. The question now was whether those walls could be torn down, whether the distance he had traveled could be retraced, whether a man who had lost his way could find the road that led home. As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Samuel opened the telegram from his business partner. It contained news of railroad contracts and investment opportunities, of meetings scheduled and profits projected, all the elements of the life he had built in pursuit of success. But instead of rushing to respond, Samuel folded the telegram and set it aside. For the first time in years, he had more important things to consider than business. He had a house to decide about, a community to reconnect with, and a life to rebuild on foundations that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with the simple, radical act of choosing love over ambition. The boy who had once carved wooden animals for neighbor children was still there, buried beneath years of calculation and compromise. Samuel's mother had believed that, and now he was beginning to believe it too. Tomorrow he would write letters to Mary, to his business associates in Phoenix, to the people in Tombstone who had known his parents and might be willing to know him again. But tonight he would simply sit on this porch where his father had tried to warn him about the cost of success and listen to the desert wind carry the voices of a community that had never stopped being home. Some journeys, Samuel realized, led you far from where you started, but the most important journeys brought you back to who you were always meant to be. The inheritance his mother had left him wasn't just a house and some savings. It was a choice. The choice to value what could not be bought or sold, to invest in relationships rather than just opportunities, to build a life that would be remembered not for its impressive achievements, but for its simple decency. For the first time since leaving Tombstone, Samuel McKinnon felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Epilogue. New foundations. 6 months later, the sound of hammering echoed across Tombstone as Samuel McKinnon worked to repair the roof of the old Methodist church. It was volunteer work, the kind of community service his father had always participated in, but that Samuel had never found time for during his years in Phoenix. Now, balanced on a ladder with the Arizona sun warming his back, he discovered an unexpected satisfaction in work that served no purpose beyond helping his neighbors. "Hand me that bundle of shingles, would you?" called Jim Crawford from the ridge of the roof. The livery stable owner had organized the church repair project, and Samuel had been surprised to find himself welcomed onto the work crew despite his long absence from community life. Samuel passed up the shingles and climbed higher on the ladder. From this vantage point, he could see across the entire town, the bustling main street where miners and merchants conducted their daily business, the modest homes where families were raising children and building lives, the cemetery on the hill where his parents rested side by side. He had sold his business interests in Phoenix to Henry Colburn, taking a substantial loss but gaining something more valuable: the freedom to rebuild his life on different principles. The house his mother had left him was now home to more than just himself. He had opened his doors to travelers passing through town and to families in temporary need of housing. The income from these arrangements was modest, but it was enough, and the house finally felt alive again. His sister Mary had visited the month before, bringing her newborn daughter and staying for 2 weeks. During long conversations on the front porch, they had begun to repair the relationship that Samuel's ambition had nearly destroyed. Mary named the baby Eloise, and when Samuel held his niece for the first time, he understood something about continuity and legacy that had nothing to do with money or property. "Samuel," called a voice from below. He looked down to see Catherine Morrison approaching the church, carrying a basket that probably contained lunch for the work crew. She had moved to Tombstone 6 weeks ago after her father decided to relocate his cattle operation closer to the railroad lines, and Samuel had been surprised to discover that her presence in town stirred feelings he had suppressed during his single-minded pursuit of success. "Miss Morrison," he called back, climbing down from the ladder. "I hope that basket contains something more substantial than the hardtack Jim packed for us this morning." Catherine laughed, setting the basket down in the shade of a cottonwood tree. "Beef sandwiches, pickled vegetables, and apple pie from Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. She said working men needed proper nutrition." As the crew gathered for lunch, Samuel found himself part of conversations that had nothing to do with profit margins or investment strategies. Instead, they discussed the weather, the health of various townspeople, plans for the upcoming church social, and whether the territorial government would finally approve funds for a new schoolhouse. These were the kinds of conversations he had once dismissed as trivial, but now he recognized them as the substance of community life. People caring for each other, planning for the future, working together to build something better than what they had inherited. "Are you happy you came back?" Catherine asked as they sat apart from the others, sharing the apple pie and watching clouds build over the mountains. Samuel considered the question carefully. "I'm not the same person who left," he said finally. "That man was chasing something he thought would make him happy. This man is learning to be content with what he has." "And what do you have?" Samuel looked around at the town where he'd been born, at the people who had known his parents and were slowly coming to know him again, at the simple pleasure of useful work and honest relationships. "More than I realized," he said. "More than I deserved." That evening, as Samuel sat on his front porch reading one of his father's books, he reflected on the journey that had brought him full circle. He had left Tombstone as a young man hungry for success and recognition, convinced that happiness lay somewhere beyond the horizon. He had achieved everything he thought he wanted, wealth, status, independence, only to discover that he had been pursuing the wrong kind of riches. The real inheritance his parents had left him wasn't the house or the savings account. It was the example of lives lived with integrity, the memory of love that persisted despite disappointment, and the possibility of redemption for a man willing to acknowledge his mistakes and change course. Samuel McKinnon had learned the hardest lesson of all, that some things, once lost, could never be fully recovered. But he had also learned that it was never too late to start building something new on the foundation of what remained. As the stars emerged in the desert sky, Samuel thought about his mother's final words and his father's patient wisdom. They had given him everything he needed to live a meaningful life. He had simply been too young and too proud to understand their gifts. Now finally, he was ready to accept his inheritance in full.